Hey guys, tonight we begin with a slow glide into a familiar yet strangely layered moment in history. The Boston Tea Party of December 16, 1773. Grab your cozy blanket, dim the lights, maybe make a cup of tea or coffee. We won't judge and settle in. We're going to take our time. No popcorn moments here. Just us, a few chests of tea, and some colonial angst. Let me whisper a little of the background before we drift fully into the scene. The British Empire, stretched thin after war and debt, had been imposing taxes on the American colonies in ways that increasingly annoyed, well, everyone. One of the lingering symbols, a tax on tea, even after a bunch of other taxes had been repealed. Census, Gov. +3. History. +3. Encyclopedia Britannica. +3. And then came the Tea Act, a curious twist. It allowed the East India Company to sell tea directly to the colonies, undercutting other merchants, cutting out the intermediaries. That rubbed the colonists the wrong way, less because the tea was more expensive. In fact, it could be cheaper, and more because it felt like an imposed monopoly. Reddit. +2. Wikipedia. +2. So the stage was set, ships arrived, colonists got restless, and on a chilly December night things got weird. Part 1. The chill before the storm. It was in the harbor of Boston Harbor, Massachusetts, where 3 tea-laden ships had anchored: the Dartmouth, the Aliner, and the Beaver. History. +2. Encyclopedia Britannica. +2. The mood among the colonists had been simmering for some time. The slogan, "No taxation without representation," floated through meeting houses, taverns, and printed broadsides. But as so often happens with slogans, the real irritant was a bit more mundane. Merchants losing business, customs officers, tea forced on them from afar. The tradition of smuggling tea, Dutch tea, for example, had become common because it bypassed the British system. Wikipedia. +1. Governor Thomas Hutchinson of Massachusetts, feeling bound to uphold the law and perceived British privileges, insisted that the ships be allowed to land their tea and fulfill their obligation. Encyclopedia Britannica. That, of course, further irritated many locals, because in their minds this wasn't just a simple logistics moment. It was a flashpoint of identity and power. Are you going to rule us, or are we going to govern ourselves? On the evening of December 16, roughly 60 to maybe 100 men, accounts vary, gathered. Many disguised themselves as Native Americans, specifically Mohawks, apparently both as a disguise and perhaps as a symbolic statement. We'll gently nod at the symbolism here. History. +2. Encyclopedia Britannica. +2. They climbed the ships, opened the hatches, and dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbor. Encyclopedia Britannica. +1. It's worth a moment to marvel at the details. They smashed the tea chests with hatchets or axes, ensuring the tea would be ruined, not simply dumped intact. History. They moved with surprising order, according to some eyewitnesses. After the job was done, they even swept up the decks of the ships, tidied things, replaced a padlock that had been removed. Because, why not maintain civility, even when you're flinging cargo into the sea? A bit of colonial class concern, perhaps. Reddit. +1. So the harbor that night became a floating carpet of tea leaves, crates bobbing in the winter waves. The value of the tea then was about £18,000 in British pounds of the day, a sizable sum. Encyclopedia Britannica. +1. For a moment, imagine Boston Harbor, quiet other than the slap of waves, the icy air, the silhouettes of ships and men in rough blankets and headdresses doing their thing. Part 2. The personalities and the ironies. Let's drift now into some of the individuals, because people make history weird, and that's good for us in our sleepy narration. There was Samuel Adams, who often gets the spotlight. He was a leading voice in the resistance, part of the group known as the Sons of Liberty. Adams was not a shy wallflower. He wrote, he spoke, he organized. But ironically, he He also had, by some accounts, interests in smuggled tea himself. Yes, those who publicly protested tea taxes sometimes privately benefited from avoiding them. Gentle snark noted. Reddit. +1. So here's a man who is roaring liberty, while quietly making sure his pockets aren't too empty. Human, right? We like that. Then there's the East India Company. Massive, semi-governmental, global in reach. Some of the tea on those ships was theirs. They held a monopoly granted by Parliament over the tea trade to America after the Tea Act. Colonists saw this as unfair. They still had to pay the duty tax on the tea even if the price dropped, and the local intermediaries, smugglers, small merchants were cut out. Reddit. +2. Encyclopedia Britannica. +2. So one might say, the protest was as much about corporate preference and local resentment as it was about a generic tax. And then there's Governor Hutchinson, trying to maintain law and order while representing the crown. You can picture him, stern in his fine coat, watching the tea crisis grow, knowing that if he backs down, everything unravels, and if he pushes forward, people get angrier. The tragedy, or the gentle gloom of it, is that his loyalty to rule meant he landed in the crosshairs of the colonists' fury. Often forgotten, not everyone was thrilled about the tea dumping. George Washington, for example, despite being on the colonial side later, expressed disapproval of the destruction of property. History. +1. Which adds a dash of complexity. Yes, there was a cause, but not unanimous support for the method. Let's float over to how this moment links into the larger trajectory of events. It wasn't just about tea. It signaled that rule and subject were shifting. The colonists were saying, "We might not bleed in battle today, but we can throw your tea into the sea. That matters." Part 3. Aftermath and the quiet unraveling. So what happens after all the chests hit the water? The British government doesn't sigh and walk away. Instead, it reacts, predictably. Parliament passed what the colonists called the Coercive Acts, or the Intolerable Acts in colonial parlance, in 1774. These targeted Massachusetts specifically. History. +1. The harbor was closed to trade until the tea was paid for. British officials were given immunity from some local prosecutions. Colonial self-rule was tamped down. You can imagine the tension building, the lid twisting. Many colonists felt, we went too far. Others felt, yes, we finally went somewhere. The effect, farther unification among the colonies. The First Continental Congress met in 1774, in part because the response to Boston made clear that Massachusetts was being singled out, and that if they didn't stand together, they might be next. Census, Gov. +1. Within months, shooting would begin at the Battle of Lexington and Concord, April 1775. Encyclopedia Britannica. +1. You'll note we didn't talk about heroic epics, we didn't talk about dramatic battlefields. Instead, we glided through a harbor, boxes of tea, men in blankets, and a ripple effect that swelled into war. There's something melancholic in that. A small protest, and then the gears of empire and revolution clicking into motion. Also, there's the irony that the very act meant to express freedom and representation was, in one sense, executed by men who benefited from the system's smugglers, merchants, even as they decried it. It's a reminder that history is messy. The taxation without representation slogan is catchy, yes, but behind it were layers of commerce, identity, loyalty, resentment, privilege. And wonderfully softly, it impacted the world. The population of the 13 colonies in 1773 was around 2.4 million, give or take, when the Tea Party happened. Census, Gov. The move towards independence was gradual, not an instant explosion. The Tea Party didn't in itself declare independence, but it lit a fuse. The British government's reaction, the colonial pushback, the shared outrage, these built up until 1776. Part 4. Reflections, small anecdotes, and sleep-friendly tangents. Before we wrap up tonight, the first part of our journey, I'd like to drift into some of the more subtle, almost bedtime story-ish elements of this tale. The disguises, the men who boarded the ships dressed as Mohawks. Now they didn't adopt the full cultural life of Mohawk people, that'd be a whole other tangent. The disguise served two purposes, anonymity and symbolism. It sent a message: we are not just colonists in a British colony, we align with the land with a broader idea of self. At the same time, yes, it was a handy cloak for mischief. Encyclopedia Britannica. +1. The sweeping of the deck after dumping tea, it's such a small detail but so telling. After the dramatic act, they cleaned up. They replaced locks. They ensured no other cargo was harmed. Because for them, this was not chaotic rioting, it was calculated protest. That gives a certain softness to the story. There's anger, yes, but there's care. Reddit. The tea itself, one might think the colonists dumped tea just because it was taxed. But larger picture, they resented the monopoly and the forced choice. They couldn't choose to buy from their preferred merchants. They felt the system was rigged. And when they acted, they made sure the tea couldn't be sold. They didn't take it for themselves. They ruined it. That says something about principle or calculus or both. History. +1. And the quiet voices of dissent. Figures like Washington and Benjamin Franklin weren't always ecstatic about the destruction of property. They worried this kind of action undermined respect for order. So yes, even among revolutionaries there were different opinions. History is not uniform. History. So as you lie back, imagine Boston Harbor in 1773. The sound of water lapping, the cold air, the ship's creak, crates tumbling. A small group of men determined, the world changing quietly around them. Hey there again, if you're still awake, congratulations. That means you survived an entire harbor full of soggy tea. Tonight, we're floating onward, gently through the slow, echoing aftermath of the Boston Tea Party. The water has settled, the chests are gone, and the air smells faintly like regret and Earl Grey. So, what happens when a few dozen colonists toss the British East India Company's profits into the sea? You'd think maybe some angry letters, a few fines, and everyone moves on. But no, because we're dealing with Britain in the 18th century, and subtlety was not really their thing. Let's drift through the year 1774, a year of paperwork, punishments, and growing paranoia. The British government, sitting comfortably across the Atlantic, was not amused. Lord North, the Prime Minister, reacted in that classic imperial way, by overcorrecting. Parliament drafted the asterisk coercive acts. The colonists would soon call them the asterisk intolerable acts, because apparently sarcasm was the only weapon they had left. 4 main laws came out of this imperial tantrum. 1. The Boston Port Act ***, which closed Boston Harbor until the East India Company was compensated for its tea. Basically, no tea, no trade. And for a port city, that's like cutting off oxygen. 2. The Massachusetts Government Act ***, which dissolved most of the local self-rule and put power squarely in the hands of the royal governor. So much for local democracy. 3. The Administration of Justice Act ***, which said that any British official accused of crimes could be tried back in England. You know, just in case local juries got too emotional about soldiers shooting them. 4. The Quartering Act ***, which required colonists to house British troops if necessary. Because nothing says trust like soldiers in your spare room. For many colonists, this was less about taxes and more about humiliation. Closing the harbor was one thing, but telling them they couldn't govern themselves, that stung. Let's float down the coastline for a bit, to places like New York, Philadelphia, Charleston. Most colonies watched Boston's punishment with a kind of horrified fascination. It was like seeing your loud cousin finally get grounded by your strict uncle. You felt bad, but also slightly impressed. Meetings started popping up everywhere. Colonial assemblies sent letters, sympathy funds, even food to Boston because with the harbor shut, the city was starving. The port's economy collapsed almost overnight. Merchants went broke. Dockworkers lost jobs. Fishermen couldn't fish. It wasn't exactly a feel-good montage. But in a weirdly poetic way, The intolerable acts did something the British never intended. They made the colonies talk to each other. For the first time, people in distant provinces started saying things like, "Maybe we should do something together." That's how the First Continental Congress was born. Picture it, September 1774. Philadelphia. 40-something delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies, Georgia being busy doing Georgia things. They gathered at Carpenter's Hall. The air was stuffy, the politics delicate. You had your fiery types, like Patrick Henry and Sam Adams, ready to light a match, and your cautious types, like John Dickinson, who wanted to send a politely worded complaint instead. The debates were exhausting. Imagine a group project with 13 people who hate each other's accents. Eventually, they agreed on two main things. One, they'd send a Declaration of Rights to King George III, politely reminding him that they were still loyal, just deeply disappointed. Two, they'd agree on a colony-wide boycott of British goods, which was basically the 18th century version of unfollowing someone on social media. The boycott hit hard. British merchants started losing money. And because economics always moves faster than politics, that's when London started sweating. Meanwhile, back in Boston, things were not great. Governor Thomas Gage, a man who probably didn't want this job in the first place, arrived with fresh troops. He was supposed to restore order. Instead, he found himself surrounded by colonists arming themselves, forming militias, and holding secret town meetings. Because of course they did. If you've ever tried to control people by force while simultaneously pretending it's for their own good, you'll understand Gage's problem. Every new soldier sent from London just convinced more colonists that independence might actually be worth considering. Samuel Adams was still there, of course, being his usual persuasive, slightly exhausting self. He kept stirring public opinion, hosting meetings, and writing letters. He's the kind of guy who probably would have been banned from every modern Facebook group for excessive posting. But he got results. John Hancock, a wealthy merchant with a flair for drama, also stepped into the spotlight. Fun fact, before he became the giant signature guy on the Declaration of Independence, he was basically a tax-dodging smuggler. He made his fortune ignoring British trade laws and pretending it was patriotism, which it sort of was, accidentally. Let's pause for a sleepy tangent about *T itself. The tea they dumped into Boston Harbor wasn't just any random mix. It was primarily Bohea *, Kangoo ***, and Souchong, all black teas from China, processed under the East India Company's watchful eye. And the irony? Many colonists actually loved this tea. It was the daily comfort drink in colonial households. The whole protest, then, was not about having tea, it was about who got to sell it. Imagine boycotting your favorite coffee brand not because of the flavor, but because a monopoly is forcing you to buy it from one smug corporate cousin. That's basically what happened. And no, the harbor didn't actually smell like one giant teapot afterward. The tea soaked, fermented, and rotted over time. Locals said the water reeked for months. Fish avoided the area. Boston became the world's least appealing herbal bath. As we drift into 1775, tensions reached that delicate, jittery stage before a fight actually breaks out. The kind of quiet where everyone pretends to be calm while slowly sharpening their bayonets. The British still believed this was a law and order issue, a few troublemakers causing unrest. They didn't yet realize it was morphing into something else entirely. And the colonists, well, they were starting to whisper that word, the I word, independence. It was still an unpopular idea, of course. Most colonists weren't ready to give up being British. They just wanted to be respected British. It's kind of like staying in a bad relationship, but hopping your partner will magically change. Spoiler, they didn't. Let's drift for a moment into the personality of King George III. Because if we're going to talk about tea, rebellion, and empire, we should peek into the royal side of this melodrama. George III was, and I say this kindly, a bit of a control enthusiast. He genuinely thought he was doing the right thing. He believed in divine right, in discipline, and in the importance of keeping the empire tidy. Unfortunately, he also had the emotional flexibility of a granite countertop. When news of the Boston Tea Party reached him, he didn't pace the palace muttering, "Maybe we went too far." No, he reportedly said, "The die is now cast. The colonies must either submit or triumph," which is a fancy royal way of saying, "Oh, it's on." You can imagine his ministers nodding solemnly, secretly praying someone else would deal with this mess. And just like that, the stage was set for revolution, though nobody quite realized it yet. The Tea Party was only supposed to be a message, but messages have consequences, especially when the recipient is an empire with an ego. Boston became the beating heart of rebellion. Taverns buzzed with talk of resistance. Broadsides printed daily. Church sermons began slipping in subtle jabs about liberty. Even quiet farmers miles away started stockpiling powder and muskets, just in case protest turned into "oops, we're shooting at redcoats now." But we're not there yet. Tonight, we're still lingering in the space before the gunfire, in that strange, suspended moment when everything feels both doomed and inevitable. So as the candle burns low, let's stay with that image. Boston, 1774. The harbor closed, ships idle, the scent of wet tea leaves fatting, the people restless, the empire watching. And somewhere across the ocean, a king sipping tea, blissfully unaware that his favorite beverage just started a revolution. Hey again, welcome back. You've made it to part 3, which officially means you have more patience than most British Parliament members in 1774. So, props for that. Tonight we'll drift through what happened after the Boston Tea Party stopped being just a local bit of mischief and started becoming something bigger, a story, a symbol, and eventually, a myth. Picture Boston now. It's been months since the tea hit the water. The harbor's still closed. The docks are silent. Shops are shuttered. The city's heartbeat has slowed to a crawl. What was once a bustling seaport now feels like a ghost town wrapped in quiet defiance. The punishment, those coercive acts, worked in the worst way possible. Instead of submission, they created unity. It's kind of like when a parent grounds one kid, and suddenly all the siblings form a secret alliance against them. Let's start with the ordinary people. The dockworkers who once loaded ships now spend their days in taverns, complaining about the price of bread. Merchants keep ledgers full of crossed-out orders. Farmers around Boston bring in food donations, sneaking them past British patrols like some early form of humanitarian aid. Women play a surprisingly central role too, but history, as usual, gives them the quiet footnote treatment. Groups like the Daughters of Liberty had already been active during earlier boycotts, organizing local manufacturing, making homespun cloth, and hosting spinning bees, which sound adorable until you remember they were basically political protests disguised as sewing circles. Now, these women redoubled their efforts, replacing imported British tea with herbal Liberty tea blends. Chamomile, mint, raspberry leaves, the taste of resistance, apparently. So, when you imagine the Tea Party, don't just see men in Mohawk disguises. Think of the women who stopped buying tea afterward, the shopkeepers who refused to sell it, and the servants who poured out what was left in their employers' cupboards. The revolution was steeping quietly in kitchens long before it fired muskets on a battlefield. Meanwhile, the British troops in Boston were doing what occupying armies do best, making everything awkward. They patrolled the streets. They held drills on Boston Common. They camped in houses and taverns. There were constant little arguments, a soldier jostling a civilian, a bar fight that turned into a political statement. It was tense, but not quite war. Yet. Governor Gage, poor man, kept writing letters to London saying something like, "Please send more troops. Also, maybe a miracle." But by the time those letters crossed the Atlantic and came back, the situation on the ground had already changed again. Slow communication makes everything worse, especially revolutions. Now, while the political tension was simmering, something else was happening. The asterisk story of the Tea Party was already being rewritten. See, the event itself was meant to be secret. The men involved swore to keep quiet. Many of them weren't publicly identified until decades later. Samuel Adams himself didn't actually say, "We dumped the tea." He just winked his way through denials and public outrage. But word spread anyway. Pamphlets, gossip, and colonial newspapers retold the story in varying degrees of drama. In some versions, the tea dumpers were noble patriots standing for liberty. In others, they were rowdy vandals embarrassing the colonies. Everyone shaped it to fit their agenda. The British press, of course, had a field day. The London Gazette called the Tea Party an act of lawless mobbing. Politicians called the colonists spoiled children. One lord even referred to them as ungrateful brats throwing away their supper, which, frankly, isn't entirely inaccurate. Let's float briefly to Philadelphia, that city of endless meetings and quills scratching parchment. Benjamin Franklin was there, doing what he did best, trying to fix everything without anyone noticing how much chaos was actually happening. Franklin had been living in London at the time of the Tea Party, serving as a sort of unofficial ambassador. When he heard about the incident, he cringed. This was not the calm diplomatic progress he'd been hoping for. Ever the practical man, he even offered to personally reimburse the East India Company for the lost tea as a gesture of goodwill. London refused. Of course they did. After that, Franklin's reputation in Britain went downhill fast. He went from our favorite clever colonial to that treacherous lightning rod guy. He packed up, went home, and by the time he reached America, he was done pretending reconciliation was possible. The Tea Party had changed him too. By 1775, the phrase Boston Tea Party didn't exist yet. It wouldn't be coined until many decades later in the 1820s, actually. At the time, colonists simply called it the destruction of the tea. It wasn't viewed as a cute bit of patriotic rebellion. It was serious business. Property destruction on a massive scale. Still, the symbolism stuck. Tea wasn't just a drink anymore. It became shorthand for oppression, taxes, and the arrogance of empire. Boycotting tea became a badge of moral virtue. And that's when you start seeing the cultural side effects. People dumping their teapots, artists drawing cartoons of King George drowning in tea, merchants advertising Liberty blends. The protest went viral 18th century style. Let's pause for a sleepy digression on just how British tea culture was at this point. In the 1700s, tea wasn't just a beverage. It was an institution. Entire social rituals revolved around it. Wealthy women hosted tea parties where etiquette mattered more than conversation. Tea imported through the East India Company was a cornerstone of Britain's identity and economy. So when the colonists dumped that tea, it wasn't just economic sabotage. It was cultural heresy. It was like storming a French cafe and dumping all the wine. The symbolism cut deep. You can almost imagine some horrified noblewoman in London, mid-sip, gasping as her servant reads the morning paper. My word, they threw out the bohea. Now, let's zoom back across the ocean to Massachusetts, early 1775. Spring thaw was approaching. The farmers around Boston were getting restless. British patrols were seizing stored gunpowder and arresting anyone suspected of organizing militias. The line between protest and rebellion was thinning like old parchment. And here's the poetic part. The Tea Party itself didn't directly cause the American Revolution, but the asterisk response to it did. The coercive acts, the closing of the port, the increased troop presence, all of it pushed people from angry subjects to accidental revolutionaries. By April 1775, British troops marched out of Boston toward Lexington and Concord, supposedly to seize weapons and arrest leaders like Adams and Hancock. The result, of course, was the first gunfire of the war. The shot heard round the world. And somewhere in that echo, in the muskets, the smoke, the chaos, were the faint ripples of tea leaves sinking in Boston Harbor 2 years before. But tonight, we're not marching. We're lying back, drifting through the irony of it all. The Boston Tea Party started as a carefully planned protest. No looting, no deaths, not even drunken chaos. Just cold hands, wooden chests, and a sense of purpose. Yet its aftershocks unspooled across continents and decades. It became a story parents told their children, first as caution, later as pride. By the 19th century, American artists painted romanticized scenes of the Tea Party, full of handsome rebels and perfectly clean ships. Nobody looked cold or tired. Nobody smelled like wet tea. History got a makeover, as usual. In those later paintings, the harbor glows softly. The men stand heroically under moonlight. Even the tea crates look patriotic. It's bedtime history at its finest, the messy parts edited out for comfort.